Denis Healey walked into the cabinet room on February 2nd, 1965, carrying a folder that would end the most advanced strike aircraft Britain had ever attempted. The Defence Secretary had spent 3 weeks rereading cost projections from BAC at Wharton and Hawker Siddeley at Brough. The figures were not in dispute. TSR-2, the tactical strike and reconnaissance aircraft designed to fly at Mach 2.05 at 200 feet, would cost the Treasury roughly £750 million to bring into squadron service. Harold Wilson's government had inherited a deficit of £800 million from the Conservatives 4 months earlier. Healey told the Cabinet that afternoon that the Royal Air Force could purchase 50 American F-111Ks for less than half that figure, with an option worth another 50 aircraft. Wilson agreed. The announcement was folded into the budget speech of April 6th, delivered by James Callaghan at the dispatch box. Sir Sidney Cam, who had designed the Hurricane, called the decision the worst act of aeronautical vandalism in British history. He died 3 weeks later. The Air Ministry file on TSR-2 had been opened in 1957, weeks after Duncan Sandys published the Defence White Paper, declaring that manned aircraft were finished. Sandys was wrong, and everyone at the Ministry of Aviation knew he was wrong, because the Soviet air defence network north of Murmansk was thickening faster than any missile program could keep up with. The RAF wrote a specification, GOR.339, that demanded an aircraft capable of penetrating radar coverage at treetop height, delivering a Redbeard or WE.177 nuclear weapon on a target 1,000 nautical miles inside hostile territory, and returning without refueling. No aircraft in the world could do this in 1957. No aircraft in the world could do it in 1962. When the first TSR-2 lifted off from Boscombe Down on September 27, 1964, piloted by Roland Beaumont, it could. Beaumont's report to English Electric that evening was terse. The aircraft was faster than the wind tunnels had predicted. The undercarriage vibration on takeoff was severe, but the airframe was clean. On the second flight, the reheat malfunctioned. On the 14th flight over the Wiltshire Ranges, Beaumont flew TSR-2 supersonic without engaging afterburner on the outer engine. The Bristol Siddeley Olympus 22R was producing thrust that no American engine could match. Beaumont later told Aviation Week the aircraft handled like a fighter and delivered like a bomber, and he believed the airframe was capable of Mach 3 in a shallow climb. Officials at the Pentagon received the flight test summaries through the standard Anglo-American Technical Exchange Agreement of 1958. Robert McNamara's office at the Department of Defense had already committed $12 billion to the TFX program, which became the F-111. TFX had been running 18 months longer than TSR-2. Its first flight on December 21, 1964, was 3 months behind Beaumont's. General Dynamics at Fort Worth was struggling with the variable geometry wing pivot, the escape capsule, and the Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engine's compressor stall problem. The engine problem would not be resolved until 1970. The escape capsule would kill men before it saved them. TSR-2 had none of these problems. TSR-2 had a swing wing rejected in favor of a fixed delta because Wharton's aerodynamicists had calculated it would add weight without adding range. They were right. When McNamara's technical staff at OSD/SA read Beaumont's numbers in the winter of 1964, they could not explain how a country with a quarter of America's aerospace budget had beaten them into the air with a superior aircraft. The Ministry of Aviation on Millbank was, by 1958, running 17 combat aircraft programs simultaneously. Julian Amery, who took over as minister in July 1962, described his own department to Macmillan as a lunatic asylum, with too many patients and too few beds. The GOR.339 competition had originally attracted 9 bids from British firms. Vickers Armstrongs at Weybridge proposed the Type 571, a slim twin-engined aircraft with a shoulder wing. English Electric at Wharton, working with the team that had built the Canberra and the Lightning, proposed something bigger and faster, drawing on the P.17A study. In January 1959, the ministry told the two firms they would have to merge their proposals, or nobody would win. Sir George Edwards of Vickers and Freddie Page of English Electric agreed the terms in a hotel in Weybridge over 3 days. The resulting British Aircraft Corporation was formed in June 1960, with Bristol Aeroplane Company brought in for the rear fuselage. The design office at Wharton became the lead. Weybridge kept the forward fuselage. Bristol Siddeley at Filton, formed by the merger of Bristol and Armstrong Siddeley in April 1959, would build the engine. None of this consolidation had ever been attempted before. Wharton and Weybridge had been rivals since 1935. Their design cultures were incompatible. Wharton drew in imperial units and worked from load calculations up. Weybridge drew in a mixture of imperial and metric and worked from the wing outward. The two teams argued for 4 months about the wing sweep, the intake position and the crew arrangement. Ollie Heath at Wharton and Henry Gardner at Weybridge eventually agreed the aircraft would have a small delta wing with drooped tips, side-mounted intakes and a tandem cockpit. The RAF wanted a navigator sitting behind the pilot with a rearward-looking radar display. Because low-level penetration required real-time terrain-following data that no cockpit computer of the period could process alone. Bristol Siddeley in Filton was, at the same time, building an engine that did not exist anywhere else. The Olympus had begun life in 1946 as a bomber engine for the Vulcan. By 1961, the 2.2R variant was producing 30,610 pounds of thrust with reheat and running at turbine entry temperatures higher than any production engine in the world. Stanley Hooker, the engineer in charge, had solved the compressor surge problem by fitting variable inlet guide vanes and a new fuel control unit. When the Americans obtained partial test data from a bench run at Patchway in November 1963, they concluded that Rolls-Royce, which absorbed Bristol Siddeley in 1966, was ahead of Pratt & Whitney by roughly 3 years. Denis Healey received a JIC assessment in December 1964, confirming the technical advantage. He suppressed it. The reason he suppressed it was money. TSR-2 was not costing more than the F-111 in absolute terms. It was costing more per aircraft because the RAF wanted only 138 of them. The Americans planned to build 1,468 F-111s. Unit costs collapse with production volume. Denis Healey knew this, so did Harold Wilson. The cabinet was told, in Wilson's phrase, that the RAF was being offered a Rolls-Royce when a Ford would do. The Ford in this case was the F-111K, which the Americans were prepared to sell at $5.95 million per aircraft under a 1965 memorandum. The Rolls-Royce TSR-2 was quoted at approximately £4 million per aircraft. When Solly Zuckerman, the government's chief scientific advisor, was asked in Cabinet Committee on April 1, 1965, whether the F-111 could match TSR-2's performance, he said no. He was ignored. Sir Solly Zuckerman had spent the previous 15 months trying to kill TSR-2. His files at Whitehall, later deposited at the University of East Anglia, show a man moving between 3 overlapping arguments. The first was that manned strike aircraft were obsolete, because Polaris submarines would soon carry the British deterrent. The second was that the RAF could not justify a 1,000-mile penetration aircraft east of Suez, when the government was already planning withdrawal. The third was that the money would be better spent on the Concorde. Zuckerman lost the third argument in November 1962 when Julian Amery signed the Anglo-French Concorde Treaty in a form deliberately drafted to prevent cancellation. He won the first two, but he did not win them on the technical merits. He won them because the Treasury needed the win. Sir William Armstrong, Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, sent Wilson a minute on January 12, 1965, stating that Britain could not afford both TSR-2 and the East of Suez commitment. Wilson had promised the American administration that Britain would maintain its bases in Singapore, Aden and Bahrain, because Lyndon Johnson wanted an Anglo-Saxon presence east of the Malacca Strait, while he escalated in Vietnam. Wilson could not withdraw the promise without wrecking sterling. The pound was under pressure, the IMF was watching. Something had to be sacrificed, and the aircraft was the largest single item on the defence budget that could be cut with a single cabinet decision. Wharton learned of the decision at 2:15 in the afternoon on April 6, 1965, from a BBC news bulletin. Freddie Page was in his office. He walked to the shop floor and told the foreman. The following morning, on ministry instructions, engineers began sawing the completed airframes into scrap. 24 aircraft were in various stages of construction at Preston, Samlesbury and Weybridge. XR220, the second prototype, had been ready for flight for 4 months but had never flown because of a delivery accident. XR222, XR223 and XR224 were on the production line. All were destroyed. The jigs were cut up. The tooling was scrapped. The blueprints were ordered to be burned, though a set survived because a manager at Wharton, R.F. Creasy, boxed them and stored them in his garage. The ministry insisted on the destruction because it wanted no possibility of the program being revived by a future government. The reason for the destruction was not vindictive. It was contractual. The F-111K purchase agreement, signed provisionally on April 27, 1966, included an option clause requiring the British government to certify that TSR-2 was terminated beyond recovery. The Americans wanted no competitor. General Dynamics was, at that stage, running 2 years behind schedule on TFX, and did not want a British aircraft in flight tests that made the F-111 look ordinary. Robert McNamara had promised Congress the F-111 would be exported to Britain, Australia and West Germany, generating enough foreign sales to reduce unit costs. If Britain built TSR-2, the Australians and Germans would not buy F-111. So the airframes at Wharton were cut into small enough pieces that no reconstruction would ever be attempted, and the Americans watched the process through the RAF liaison at the British Embassy in Washington. The F-111K was cancelled in January 1968. Britain never received an aircraft. The RAF had, by then, no strike aircraft capable of the low-level nuclear role. Denis Healey wrote in his 1989 memoirs, The Time of My Life, that the cancellation of TSR-2 was the decision he most regretted. He did not admit this at the time. In the years after 1968, the RAF operated Vulcan B.2s in the low-level role, painted in dark green and dark sea grey camouflage, carrying WE-177 freefall nuclear weapons at heights the airframe had not been designed for. The Vulcans had been built for high-altitude penetration in the 1950s. Duncan Sandys and the Soviet SA-2 missile had ended that role. When Francis Gary Powers was shot down at 70,500 feet over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960, the V-Force at Waddington and Scampton switched to low level within the year. Vulcans were not stressed for it. Crews reported fatigue cracks in the wing box by 1965. The aircraft that TSR-2 was designed to replace continued in service for another 16 years, and killed several crews doing it. The RAF's alternative to TSR-2 and F-111K, decided upon in early 1968, was to join the multi-role combat aircraft program with West Germany and Italy. This became Tornado. The Panavia Tornado GR-1 entered service with No. 9 Squadron at RAF Honington in June 1982, 17 years after TSR-2 was cancelled. Tornado was capable in the low-level strike role, but not as capable as TSR-2 would have been. Its combat radius was shorter. Its top speed was lower. Its penetration profile relied on terrain-following radar developed in Britain by Ferranti at Edinburgh, using algorithms first tested for the TSR two-nose radar in 1963. The technology survived, the airframe did not. The consequences of the cancellation fanned outward through the British aerospace industry for 2 decades. English Electric's design office at Wharton lost roughly 400 engineers between 1965 and 1967. Bristol Siddeley lost the Olympus 22R production line, which had been running at Patchway with orders for 265 engines. Vickers at Weybridge closed the Military Aircraft Design Office in 1966 and concentrated on the VC-10 and the collapsing BAC-111. The subcontractor base, some 400 firms across the Northwest, the Midlands and the South Coast, contracted sharply. Elliott Automation, Ferranti, Marconi, Smiths Industries and Plessey lost the largest single avionics contract in Europe. The airborne radar research at Ferranti Edinburgh continued only because the same laboratory won the Blue Fox contract for the Sea Harrier 8 years later. The strategic consequences were larger. Britain had built, at Wharton and Filton, an aircraft that outperformed the machine Robert McNamara had chosen as the centerpiece of American tactical air power. The engineering achievement was verified by American observers. It was not a paper aeroplane. It flew 24 times. Roland Beamon wrote in his log after the 24th flight that the aircraft had reached 30,000 feet in a climb from Wharton in under 4 minutes, and that stability and control at low level in turbulence were better than any aircraft he had ever flown, including the Lightning. The Americans, when they finally got the F-111A into full service in 1968, discovered that it could not do the mission McNamara had bought it for. 6 were lost in Operation Combat Lancer over Vietnam in the spring of 1968, 3 of them without any known cause. The wing pivot failed on operational aircraft in 1969. The escape capsule proved lethal to some crews who ejected in flat spins. The Ferranti radar program, which was quietly moved from TSR-2 to smaller applications, requires explanation because it illustrates what Britain retained from the wreckage. Ferranti at Ferry Road in Edinburgh had, by 1963, developed the Blue Parrot low-level attack radar for the Buccaneer and was working on a much more advanced set for TSR-2, designated FLR.1. This radar used a monopulse tracking system with terrain-following logic that could hold the aircraft at 200 feet above ground level while flying at 700 knots. No comparable American system existed. When TSR-2 was cancelled, the FLR.1 team was reassigned. Some went to Blue Fox for the Sea Harrier, some went to Fox Hunter for the Tornado F.3. Some went to Blue Vixen, which entered service on the Sea Harrier FA.2 in 1993. The technical lineage runs through every serious British airborne radar of the last 30 years of the Cold War. Rolls-Royce, which absorbed Bristol Siddeley in October 1966, kept the Olympus in production for the Vulcan and, in modified form, for Concorde. The Olympus 593 that powered Concorde was a direct development of the 22R, designed for TSR-2. Concorde's engines were on the technical measure of specific fuel consumption at supersonic cruise, the most efficient turbojets ever built. This did not save Rolls-Royce from bankruptcy in February 1971, when the RB211 fan blade program collapsed under the weight of American Lockheed contracts. Edward Heath's government nationalised Rolls-Royce on February 4, 1971. To prevent the RB211 from collapsing entirely, and to protect the Olympus, the Pegasus that powered the Harrier, and the Spey that powered the Buccaneer and Phantom. The nationalisation in retrospect was a cheaper alternative to defence procurement failure than the loss of TSR-2 had been. British Aerospace, formed by the 1977 nationalisation of BAC and Hawker Siddeley, became the vehicle through which the surviving expertise was pooled. Wharton retained the Strike Aircraft Design Office. Freddie Page, who had led TSR-2, ran BAC Preston Division through the difficult years and delivered the Jaguar with Dassault, the Tornado with MBB and Air Italia, and the initial concept work for the experimental aircraft program that became Typhoon. The Jaguar, an Anglo-French light strike aircraft, entered RAF service with No. 54 Squadron at Lossiemouth in 1974. It was, in its low-level penetration role, doing part of what TSR-2 had been designed to do, at less range and lower speed, with a smaller warload. The RAF took 165 Jaguars. It was not enough. It was not. The Nassau Agreement of December 1962, in which Harold Macmillan had persuaded John Kennedy to sell Britain Polaris after the Skybolt cancellation, had already established the principle that Britain would depend on American systems for the strategic deterrent. Polaris entered service with HMS Resolution in June 1968, 3 years after TSR-2 was cancelled. The submarine launch deterrent removed the rationale, retrospectively, for a British long-range strike bomber. Solly Zuckerman had been correct about this. The RAF nuclear role after 1968 was tactical, not strategic. The Vulcan carried WE.177 for tactical strike in Germany. The Buccaneer carried WE.177 for maritime strike from Lossiemouth. The Tornado carried WE.177 from 1982, until the weapon was withdrawn in 1998. None of these missions required an aircraft with TSR-2's range. What TSR-2 had offered and what Britain lost was independent capability. Sir Solly Zuckerman had been correct on the mission requirement. He had been wrong about the industrial base. The industrial argument was made most clearly by Sir George Edwards of BAC in a memorandum to the Wilson government in March 1965, 3 weeks before cancellation. Edwards wrote that TSR-2 was employing 20,500 people directly at BAC and Bristol Siddeley, and roughly 40,000 more in the subcontractor network. Cancellation would remove skilled labour that Britain would not be able to reconstitute at similar cost within a decade. He was not asking for the aircraft to be preserved on employment grounds alone. He was asking whether Wilson had understood that once these teams were dispersed, the country would be unable to build a comparable aircraft again without American technology transfer. Wilson wrote in the margin of Edwards' letter in his own hand that the country could not afford sentimentality about industrial capability when the balance of payments was in crisis. The balance of payments was, in April 1965, running at a deficit of £600 million on the year. Sterling was under speculative attack from Zurich and Basel. James Callaghan at the Treasury spent much of the spring negotiating a $1.5 billion standby facility from the Federal Reserve, which required, informally, that Britain reduce its defence commitments. Robert McNamara at the Pentagon and Douglas Dillon at Treasury had made clear to Wilson's officials that American financial support was contingent on Britain buying American defence equipment. The F-111K purchase was, in this sense, not a decision made against TSR-2. It was a decision made in favour of American credit lines. The F-111K was the price paid for the standby facility. The British negotiators understood this. The public did not. The public understanding of TSR-2 was shaped by the newspapers, which were divided along the lines of the Cold War itself. The Daily Express, then owned by Beaverbrook, ran a campaign against cancellation and printed on April 8, 1965, a front page headed "Aircraft Murder." The Times ran a leader supporting the government on financial grounds. The Guardian was ambivalent. Chapman Pincher at the Express, whose intelligence sources at MI5 and the Air Ministry were unrivalled, wrote a series of pieces between April and June 1965, arguing that the American government had leaned on Wilson to kill the aircraft. He could not prove it in print. The evidence which reached the National Archives at Kew in the 1990s largely supports his account. Peter Thornycroft, Minister of Aviation until 1962, and by then in opposition, told the House of Commons on April 14, 1965, that the Wilson government had committed the greatest single act of self-inflicted damage to British industrial capability since the war. Duncan Sandys, whose 1957 White Paper had originally threatened the aircraft, defended TSR-2 in the same debate. This was politically remarkable. Sandys was arguing against the logic of his own earlier position because he had watched the missile promises of 1957 fail through the 1960s. Blue Streak had been cancelled in 1960. Blue Water had been cancelled in 1962. Skybolt had been cancelled by the Americans in 1962. Every missile Britain had bet on to replace manned aircraft had failed. TSR-2 was the aircraft the missiles were supposed to have made unnecessary. When the missiles collapsed, the aircraft was still cancelled anyway. Denis Healey knew all of this. His files at the MOD, released in 1997, show he received a JIC assessment in February 1965, warning that Soviet air defense upgrades in East Germany would render the F-111K obsolete within a decade. He proceeded with the F-111K purchase notwithstanding. He was, by his own later admission, prioritizing the short-term fiscal position over the medium-term strategic capability. Wilson agreed. The American reaction to the cancellation when it came was surprise, followed by discomfort. Robert McNamara had been told by his own analysts in late 1964 that TSR-2 was technically ahead of the F-111. The Central Intelligence Agency, in a memorandum dated December 11, 1964, and released under Freedom of Information in 1998, assessed British aerospace research and development at BAC Wharton, Bristol Siddeley Patchway, and Ferranti Edinburgh as producing equipment that, in specific aspects, particularly airborne radar and low-level penetration systems, was superior to any American equivalent then in flight test. The CIA memorandum recommended that the Pentagon accelerate technical exchange with Britain to prevent the diffusion of these capabilities to third countries. Britain, from the CIA's perspective, was not a competitor. It was an ally whose technical advances the Americans wanted to absorb. The absorption took place through the F-111K program. When British Air Staff officers went to Fort Worth in 1966 to work on the aircraft's specification, they carried with them lessons from TSR-2. The terrain-following radar for the F-111 was improved after these consultations. The escape capsule design was reviewed but not fundamentally altered. The Air Staff officers concluded that the F-111K would be delivered late, over budget, and would not meet the specification the RAF had written. They said so in a paper submitted to Healey in October 1967. Healey filed the paper and pressed on. The F-111K was cancelled by Denis Healey on January 16, 1968. The reason given was cost. The actual reason was that the aircraft was failing its own flight test program in Nevada, and the RAF liaison officer at Nellis Air Force Base, Wing Commander Peter Chamberlain, had reported through the air attaché in Washington that the aircraft would not be operational before 1972 at the earliest, 3 years late. Chamberlain had watched an F-111A break up in mid-air on December 22, 1967 during a routine test flight, killing the pilot. The wing pivot fitting had failed. The same failure occurred on operational aircraft in Vietnam in the spring of 1968. Britain therefore ended the TSR-2 saga in early 1968, with no strike aircraft, no F-111, and £2.5 million of sunk costs on the F-111K contract that could not be recovered. The Vulcan continued in the low-level role. The Buccaneer, originally designed for the Royal Navy and rejected for RAF service in 1957, was hurriedly ordered from Blackburn's factory at Brou in 1968 as the interim solution. The RAF took 46 Buccaneers from the Fleet Air Arm after the Ark Royal was withdrawn, plus 43 newly built S-2Bs from Brou. The Buccaneer, a subsonic aircraft designed for maritime strike, became the RAF's medium-range strike aircraft in Germany from 1969 onward. It served in that role for over a decade. Its crews were competent. The aircraft was competent. It was not TSR-2. Denis Healey visited BAC Wharton in 1969, 4 years after cancellation. Freddie Page showed him around the shop floor. There were no aircraft on the production line. There were empty jigs where TSR-2 had been assembled, then dismantled. Healey wrote later that he found the visit painful. He asked Page whether the aircraft, had it survived, would have justified the cost. Page, who had known Wilson personally and had drafted BAC's petition against cancellation, told Healey the aircraft would have been in frontline service until at least the mid-1980s and, would have exported to Australia and possibly Canada. Healey noted the conversation without comment. Roland Beamon retired from BAC in 1979. He gave an interview to Aeroplane Monthly that autumn, in which he was asked what he remembered most about TSR-2. He said the aircraft had been designed by men who knew exactly what they were building and cancelled by men who did not know what they were destroying. He offered no further elaboration. Beamon had test-flown the Tempest in 1944, the Lightning in 1957, and the TSR-2 in 1964. He was, at the time of the interview, the only man alive who had piloted all three at first flight. He died in 2001. The aircraft that survived cancellation are held at two locations. XR220, which never flew, is at the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford, painted white and cream, in the condition it was in when work stopped in April 1965. XR222, which was almost complete when cancelled, is at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, having been rescued from Cranfield in the late 1970s. Both are stripped of engines, avionics and hydraulics. Neither will fly again. The blueprints saved by R.F. Creasy at Wharton were returned to BAE in the 1980s and are now held by the archive of the Northwest Heritage Group. The strategic assessment of the cancellation made by the historian Peter Hennessy in his 2002 study of Cold War Britain is that TSR-2 represented the last moment at which Britain could have retained an independent strike aircraft capability of first rank. After 1965, all major British combat aircraft were built collaboratively with European or American partners. Jaguar was Anglo-French. Tornado was tripartite. Typhoon was four-nation. Britain did not build another combat aircraft on its own. The Hawk trainer, designed at Kingston by Hawker Siddeley and first flown in 1974, was the last purely British military aircraft to enter series production. It was a trainer, not a strike aircraft. Sir Solly Zuckerman lived until 1993 and never publicly recanted his opposition to TSR-2. He said when asked in 1985 that the decision had been correct on economic grounds and that the aircraft would have bankrupted the country. The historical record examined by Lawrence Freedman and others suggests he overstated the case. The £750 million estimated cost spread over 7 years of production and 20 years of operation would have added roughly 3% to the annual defence budget in the peak procurement years. Zuckerman, who was a scientific advisor without operational responsibility, was measuring the aircraft against opportunity cost in civil research. The air staff was measuring it against the Soviet air defence forces. Both were correct within their own frame. Denis Healey in his memoirs offered the fullest confession. He wrote that TSR-2 had been the finest strike aircraft in the world in 1965, that its cancellation had been justified only by the impossibility of paying for it and the East of Suez commitment simultaneously, and that if he had known in 1965 what he knew in 1968 about the F-111, he would have found the money for TSR-2 and cancelled Polaris instead. This was a substantial admission from the minister who had signed the cancellation order. It was made in 1989, 24 years after the fact. By then, Wharton no longer had the engineers, Filton no longer had the machinists, and Britain no longer had the industrial base to build such an aircraft. What the Americans could not explain in 1964 about how Britain had beaten them into the air, they no longer needed to explain. The capacity that had produced the answer had been dismantled by the country that possessed it.